Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today we have a Manning author on our podcast again after a long period. We have Dave MacLeod. Welcome, Dave. How are you?
Hello, pretty good.
And I forgot to say the name of the book. So we're just talking about the name of the book. It may change, but as of right now, it's called Learn Rust in a Month of Lunches. I feel like that makes the book much easier to digest, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's what comes to my mind, because it's like if you can crack it open during like an hour of lunch, it's pretty easy to get through now.
Yeah, and that's a pretty popular series at Manning. There's there's like 20 of those, I think, already. Learn, this and learn Kubernetes in a month of lunches, which I think is probably impossible. But
I mean, I guess it depends on how much you need to learn, right? Like,
yeah,
Rust is huge all by itself. So how much Rust do you really need to learn, though, too? Like, is it actually possible to learn enough Rust in this book that's like a month of lunches? I mean, or do you think that this is just kind of scratching the surface?
I think it's probably you would need a 2-hour lunch to do it. And you would need to do it. So there's 24 chapters. So if you were also doing weekends and if you spent every lunch hour with the book and then also did like these 4-hour power lunches over the weekend, then you could do it.
Yeah, I mean, I started reading this last night in bed, and I don't know if I got to the first chapter or not, but today I was just kind of going through it. I got through. I'm already at chapter 5.
I guess it's pretty readable.
Well, it also depends on your background. We're kind of talking about who this book is made for. Maybe you can kind of talk about the target audience.
Yeah, well, the target audience is somebody that's never learned a programming language before. It's probably someone who is kind of familiar with some terms like floats, like we were talking about before we started the podcast. But it's written essentially for me in 2019, which is when I found Rust, and that was after a lot of trying to learn programming languages and never really succeeding. So I tried all the major ones and then a few others, and I was going through this period of wanderlust, and then finally came across Rust. So back then there was the book, there were some other materials, but there weren't that many, and then most of them were they would compare it to C and C++ because Rust was trying to make a name for itself and say, hey, this is really compatible with C, with your C code, which is great. Which was not great for me because I had never touched C. So it was sometimes a little bit tough to find something that was geared for me besides the regular Rust book. And also Programming Rust was pretty good. That's another one of my favorite books, although that one does start out with some C++ comparisons. So I'd have to skip down. But yeah, this book is written for me at that time, at that period of time, basically.
Well, this is kind of leans into the book too, and kind of why you read it and the way you wrote it. Do you know what it was that made it unable for you to really learn those other languages? Like, what was it that just didn't quite catch on to you, and how does your book address that?
So Rust, the reason why Rust grabbed me is what I've always wanted to do is make games. I still haven't made one, but I want to make, I don't know if you know Ultima 7, that's my favorite game. We might be of similar age. I don't know if you ever played the Ultima games. But anyway, that's from the mid-90s. But anyway, so I always wanted to make a game like Ultima. And programming was actually something I started in the 80s with BASIC, because we had a computer at home and I just picked up BASIC. And then later on, there's a little bit of Logo at school, but then Logo I really didn't enjoy, because we had like computer labs back then in the 80s. Like, you remember, I don't know if you had computer labs in your school, but they were dark. You don't get to like open up your laptop and sit at a coffee shop back then. You'd have to actually like abhor the sunlight and go hang out with everybody in the computer lab. And on top of that, everybody at school is using Logo. And I just kind of like got the idea. Logo is this programming language where you just take a turtle and you tell it to like move around and you draw stuff. And I just kind of got the impression in elementary school that this is what software is about. And there's no internet to tell me otherwise. So I just forgot about programming languages for a while. And then later on, learned about Python in around 2010. And those ones just never grabbed me because they weren't specifically particularly good for games. JavaScript was all about like web stuff, and web stuff didn't really grab me either. And they also didn't show any of the details, any of the inner details, whereas C++ would have, but it was really intimidating, so I didn't even touch it. And then Rust came along, and I think it was the compiler that did it for me. So I had heard that Rust was like this really incredibly intimidating language. Nobody can learn it. But I still thought I'd give it a try because I was going through just trying everything, and nothing was really appealing to me. And so I gave it a try, and all of a sudden these friendly compiler messages showed up and started talking about memory, and did you mean to write this when you wrote that? And I was like, yes, that's what I meant to write. And how does the compiler know everything? And the messages themselves are almost like a textbook. And so you start to search about, why, what's this, what is borrowship about, or ownership about? And that would take you to a lot of interesting discussions, and it would just it just felt like this big, like, accessible tome of knowledge. And so it just pulled me in, and I stopped having wanderlust, and it just focused on that, and that's how it happened.
That's interesting, because for me, the compiler, I mean, yeah, it's very informative, and I think it's gotten better over time in trying to be more of a helper rather than a hindrance, but it's still like a hindrance in the beginning, right? For me, and I think quite a few others, but it doesn't sound like for you, it was never like beating you in submission. It was more guiding you, that you saw as more of a guidance rather than a punishment, right? Because for me, it was always a punishment.
Yeah. And I had no ingrained habits. Like, the only ingrained habit I had was like basic. You have actual line numbers, like go to 10, and no programming languages are using that anymore. So of course I'm not going to try to make Rust into programming like basic. But I know a lot of other people that come to it from like Java, and they want to make traits everywhere because traits are interfaces, and interfaces like you mock your code and all this stuff. And so there's a lot of like frustration there, and I've seen that with people that move to Rust after like a decade with another language. Whereas I had none of that. It was just whatever the compiler told me was like the gospel truth, basically. And so I just accepted, okay, trait is this, structs are this, enums are this, and I should write my code this way. Even like the like upper lowercase, I just followed along with that. I guess sometimes people don't like how opinionated it is about camel case versus snake case or anything like that, but I just followed along. So
it's good that you had this kind of background where you were you weren't a totally blank canvas, but you were blank enough to get some good habits and learn things along the way, right?
Yeah. So somewhat familiar, but still mostly blank, basically.
That's what makes more and more sense. I mean, like I said, I've only gone through the first 4 chapters. I'm in the 5th chapter of your book so far. And the way you wrote it, like, I did question a couple of times, like, oh, I wonder why he did it like this. Okay, so chapter 1's pretty clear. Memory, variables, and ownership. Those are very much make sense.
Yeah.
The basics, right, they kind of jump around. They're not exactly related, but I guess they are kind of basics to a certain extent. I mean, it's interesting. The first thing you talk about is comments, right? Like, why do you think comments is one of the most important things to talk about?
Not important, but just because the compiler won't even look at it. So I thought this has to be the absolute easiest thing. Yeah, the easiest thing to do is to write a comment and run the code and then have it do nothing. That's even easier than hello world. So that's why I went right near the front.
That's interesting. I mean, and you also talk about integers, chars, and strings, right? I mean, there's so many data types within Rust. Like, why talk about those 3 at the same time?
Well, I guess chars, because they're related to U30. They are like a U32, and so start out with integers. Integers make sense because numbers are like pretty much the first thing you do, and then chars are kind of related to those. And then also probably because I like talking about languages, and chars lets you talk about Unicode and then say, hey, you can express like Japanese and even Egyptian, and so I even have like the Egyptian quail chick in one of the examples to show that yes, there's pretty much you can thanks to Unicode you can have like emojis and everything, and so it's just kind of like a neat thing to show right away. you see that. I think in the Rust book as well, you have like hello, and then you have the crab for Ferris. So it's kind of like a fun thing to show that that it's kind of it's a modern language, and it's not, one of those old school languages where all the encoding breaks and you have to find like a fancy way to make it show up. And it's probably about as easy as the code can get. So I put in chapter 1.
Well, the other thing, you did kind of throw a little bit of a doozy, I think, in the beginning. When you start talking about display and debug.
Mm-hmm.
Because those are a little bit complicated, right? I mean, if you just talked about one and not the other, because maybe you can kind of give a little more information about that one, because that's kind of a zinger to put in the first chapter. No, I mean, you kind of want to give people some time before you start to throw these things in, because they're not quite simple to understand.
Yeah, that was a tough one, because you actually see it right in the compiler message when you start. If you print something that doesn't implement display, then right away it's going to stay. There's a trait that you need to implement, and that's like one of the first error messages that somebody might see. And so originally chapter 1 didn't have anything, but I had to give a small hint about traits, just to say, okay, this means like display means it can display print, and debug means it can debug print, and debug has a question mark, and just keep that in your mind for now. That's it's just because that's something that people are probably going to encounter right away. And you don't want to have that frustration. And then you can count the concept as like 10% learned by then. At least it's the message will be familiar. It's a little bit based on the there's this approach for learning languages called the direct approach, and it's you kind of like show people the language right away, and with a programming language, part of showing it is the compiler messages. And if the compiler is telling you something, then you kind of have to at least hint at it, even in the beginning. Yeah. So even if traits don't really, chapter 7 is where you really get into traits, but even before then, you just have to kind of give a little bit of a hint at least. So it's trying to keep the frustration level low at least, even though it does end up packing quite a bit into chapter 1.
Yeah, well, that's what I do like about your book, is that you do definitely say, like at the beginning, okay, we're going to talk about this much, and yes, you're going to have questions, or yes, we're going to talk more about this stuff later. Like, That's good, because for me, I mean, once I look at something, I kind of want to learn a lot about it, but I tend to jump down the rabbit hole. So, but at least when I read that part, I was like, all right, we're going to cover more. I'm just going to keep reading. And I was kind of actually satisfied. I wasn't like, wait, I want to know more about this. It was just like, all right, we're going to cover more. I'll wait, because I'm still learning, and I'm kind of building up my toolkit, right, as we're going along throughout the book. One thing I also was a little bit surprised you just quite quickly, because not a lot of people know about this, I think. And there is people who do question this, which is about shadowing.
Yeah.
It happens, but not many people know about it, right? And I thought that was very interesting that you brought that up. Like, what made you decide to bring it up in the first chapter?
I think shadowing is one of the first things that I saw in Rust, and probably even the name itself was just kind of neat. Just calling it shadowing, and it right away it shows kind of gives you a little bit of insight into the language about how lifetimes work. So that won't, you don't actually deal with lifetimes until a lot later. But to show that that something is actually still alive, you just you blocked it with by giving something else the same name. It is pretty interesting. And then I try to make it as simple as possible. Like there's an image there of you imagine that you're a teacher, and there's a kid named Brian. And Brian is an integer, and his value is 9 or something like that. And then the next day in comes another student also named Brian. And so when you call Brian, he's a string. And so every time you say Brian, the string is like he's sitting in front. And so he always answers you first. But the first Brian isn't dead or anything. He's still there. And so if the second Brian, he has a shorter scope. If he's like just there for a week, then he disappears. And then if you say Brian, then the first Brian is going to respond, and he's been there the whole time. He's just been blocked by the other one.
You just also remind me another part of the book, or the style of the book that I really loved a lot, is that you talk a lot about, you gave some real world examples, right? You tried to relate parts of programming with real life so people can actually understand what's going on. And I think that was even helpful for me, for somebody who's been programming a while, and I have different languages underneath my belt. So it's quite nice to have that. And your examples, I think for the most part, I think they made sense to me. about that, especially like the Brian one. It made sense. And you also followed up on the shadowing in the next chapter, right? Because you discussed about references and how in which shadowing and how that kind of works too. That's what's quite interesting. You didn't say directly what is shadowing. Maybe kind of good to cover that in case anybody doesn't know, because not everybody does shadowing or even sees it.
Okay. Yeah. So shadowing is it's basically when you give the same name to a different variable. And the thing that's interesting about it is when you look at it for the first time, you think it's mutation. So if you have a variable with some name, and then you say, okay, let some variable with the same name equals something else, and it might be a totally different type. That's the first thing you think is mutation. And I thought Rust didn't have mutability by default and what's going on here. And so shadowing just creates something that will probably live the same length of time as the first one, so it'll block it until the end of the scope that they're both in. But there's also a chance that the second variable will be declared in its own scope, and then for that one scope, then it'll be the only variable that gets accessed when you use the variable name. But then after the scope is over, then its lifetime is done, and all the data gets cleaned up, and the one that was declared before it is still live. And so shadowing is basically blocking. That's the way I like to term it, although the word shadowing is definitely cooler.
Yeah, the word is definitely not super clear to me.
Yeah.
For me, because I do more functional programming, so I think about rebinding when I see that.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be like a really harder concept when I first saw it. Like, okay, shadowing, get ready for like a day of thinking about how this works, and it turns out it was just blocking a variable.
Well, you also were talking a little bit before before we started recording, that this book is kind of also based on some other work that you've done before, right? So you're using existing work or you're talking about you had EasyRust, right?
Yeah, that's right. So EasyRust I made in what was that, 2020. So I wrote that, and it was about a bit less than half the size of this book, and that got pretty popular for a while. There's got like a few thousand stars on GitHub, which is pretty interesting. Although back then I barely never used GitHub, so I didn't even notice the star count. But a lot of people came along and started adding PRs, which was nice, and so that kind of and then I eventually made some videos for that, and later on. So about a year went by, and then the language had developed. So I started writing a second version on my own. And then right at that point, Manning got in touch and asked if I wanted to write a book for them. Well, to take that and to turn it into a Manning book. And conveniently, I'd already put the second edition together. I hadn't made that one public. And so I kind of thought, okay, we'll just use this the second edition I put together, and so I gave it to them. But then after that, there's a big review process, and I started adding more stuff, and reviewers asked questions, and then it turned into pretty much like half an hour every night for about a year and a bit, and just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And by now it's got the same core, but it's way bigger and up to date, and basically a different book by now.
Now, do you feel that this has made the book better, or it's just different?
I think it's made it better. It's the English is a little bit less. So the first EasyRust, I made the English absolutely as simple as possible. So I even used the what's that called? There's a Hemingway app where you paste some text in, it'll tell you what grade level is this for, and trying to keep it to a grade 6 level. Whereas with the Manning book, it has to be a little bit, because it has to be a book, so you have to have chapters, and then there's a little bit of a theme to them. Whereas the first EasyRust was just like, bang, this is what integers are, this is what chars are, and it so it wasn't as thematic. So the English is still easy, but it's a little bit more like narrative, I guess. But I would definitely say it's definitely better, because it also builds on my experience over the past 2 years and the changes in the language itself. So there are a lot of parts that just like you don't need an external crate for anymore, or some traits have been added that makes things easier. Like when I first wrote the book, you couldn't even like arrays weren't even iterators, so you had to use like a reference and then turn it into a slice, and then. That was in the last edition of Rust. So yeah, the language itself has gotten a lot better. So the book has to be better too.
Yeah, I think definitely one of the biggest changes that happened that you went over immediately was about like printline and print, where you can just put the variable names inside of the string
Yeah.
rather than outside. And
yeah, and that's one of those things that before Rust had it, it kind of gave people the impression that there was a good reason to not have like format strings, like being able to format inside to capture inside the string itself. And then because like there's a reason why there's no random numbers in the standard library, right? Like that's one of the idiosyncrasies of Rust. And there is a reason for that. And so people would think before format strings were a thing that maybe, we had this funny reason that strings have to be formatted this way and it's going to be this way forever. But it was just that the language hadn't gotten around to it yet. And that's Python has had format strings like that for a while. So people coming from that language will look at it and say, oh yeah, this is what I'm used to. And so there's a lot of like quality of life changes that are coming in now. And there are others coming up too, like, async trait isn't quite there, but it's almost there. So there's like a lot of things that you would assume would be part of the language, but that just haven't been added yet. And so they're just kind of like, rounding those corners. And whereas if you look back like 2 years ago, there's like, big feature after big feature, but now it's more like rounding out the experience. Even like scoped threads, like I guess scoped threads back in Rust 1.0 had them, and then it turned out that they were what was it? I think they let something to do with like you were able to mutate values that you shouldn't. That was like back in 2015. I didn't even know about Rust then, but they had to revert it, and then it was not until 63 versions later that they finally got them done. So there's a lot of that sort of thing.
One thing I don't see covered in here, but I'm guessing you probably must at least touch upon it, which is about async Rust. That one is really tricky. Right?
Yeah.
Do you actually talk about this?
I do. That's chapter 17, and async Rust, I teach it in sort of the opposite way that you see in the async book. So when async first came out, it was new to everybody. So I have to explain, this is it uses something called polling, and then it uses pin to pin the memory. And that made sense because, the whole Rust community was new to it. Whereas async, the way I explain it is you are trying to use, do you know the request crate for doing like URL request? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is async by default. And I also have feature flags at the same time, because a lot of the time, okay, you're new to Rust, you want to make a request. So you say, what's the biggest most common crate in its request. And so you make a request client and it says, something about async. And if you don't want to make it async, you need a blocking crate or a blocking client. And if you do that, you have to enable a feature flag. And then, what's a feature flag and why can't it find it? And so it goes over that whole experience. So you start out, okay, here's how you make a blocking client. We'll ignore async for now. Just look at the compiler message. And this, we'll learn about async in a bit. And then after that, once you get the blocking client done, then the next thing is, okay, how do I make the async client work? And the way you do that is you bring in Tokyo, and then you have to make the main function async, but then it tells you that you can't make it async because technically, main is not async. And the way you do it is you have the Tokyo main, you add that to the top. And what it does is it makes this fake async block. It makes an async scope, and then it returns. But the way Rust sees it is just a blocking. It still returns the same thing. Like it doesn't do anything to main. So that chapter goes over like every step of the way of all the weirdness that you'll encounter when you first try to use async, and that's how it explains it.
I mean, it's crazy how much you touch on stuff like, how do you decide what makes sense in what order and how to group everything in? Because your book flows, right? I can't say it doesn't, because I'm actually a super, like I wrote you a message privately saying that this is actually pretty good. I was surprised how well everything flowed together. But if you just look at the high levels, it's like, how the heck do you put this stuff together? That's why I've asked a couple times, why do you do this? Why do you do that? But like, how do you generally like come up with the grouping in this stuff? Because it's really difficult to put these different concepts in a way that flow properly.
Yeah. Well, part of that is the direct language approach that I mentioned with natural languages. So with that, say if you're introducing a natural language, first you have like, say, your learning verb. So you have the present tense. And that means you can do anything that involves present tense. And then if you want to start talking about the future, then you have to bring that in. And you keep track of what the student will know at this point, and you try to bring it in bring concepts one at a time, while still keeping things interesting. You have to have like an interesting story. Whereas with programming languages, so you would, in this book, it starts out with simple concepts. As far as until it starts to feel a little bit boring, like, okay, this is all the simple parts of Rust. And that's when it starts to move into more interesting things like structs and enums and handling errors and stuff like that. And then another part of it is based on my own experience with external crates. So what I do is I introduce them. There's a lot of them, but they don't show up anywhere in the book until later on. Because my own experience was I would sometimes find like a really nice resource when I was learning the language, but then it would suddenly say, okay, now we're going to bring in this crate and this crate and this crate, like, crossbeam for to make like a sender and a receiver, whereas I still hadn't learned the how to properly use them in the standard library. And so that was really intimidating for me. And I knew, at least at that time, that crates would sometimes come and go. Sometimes they would die, and I didn't want to spend all this time learning a crate that was maybe just going to be popular for a few months, and then a better one would come along. And I just wanted to stay with the standard library. So that's what I do in the book as well. And then it's not until later on, it's about chapter 18 or so, that's when it finally assumes that the reader has installed Rust and has like an ID set up. Because also I had that same experience. I was just using Rust on my browser. So like I had what did I have? A Surface Go, which is what I was using at the time. So it was not very good with IDEs. It was pretty slow. And anything over like 20 dependencies, it would take forever to compile. So it's for that sort of reader who might just be like learning on a browser tab for as long as possible, and then after long enough, that's when it jumps all the way into using an ID and bringing in crates, and that's when it starts to show the ecosystem, and then put some actual projects together. So that's the basics of it.
That's what I did like about the book too. Is like I was like, oh, this is really nice that you don't even need to install Rust. You could just get going with Rust Playground.
Yeah, because I bet a lot of people are trying to learn something in their spare time at work when they have nothing to do, and they're not going to be allowed to, install Visual Studio or something like that but everybody can, fiddle around and go on the internet and do something for a few minutes every day. So it's for them as well.
Yeah, and I think most of your examples, when you just copy and paste the whole thing, it just kind of works.
Mm-hmm.
Like you include the main function and everything like that, which was really pretty nice. Yeah, I also found it very difficult, like how to explain the reference to stir, ref stir, or whatever you call it. Yeah, I don't know. You explained it pretty well. I was quite surprised, and you kind of go over all these things super well. I mean, did it take you quite some time to kind of wrap your own mind around it, and then you had your own way to explain it, or?
Yeah, it did.
How did you kind of get it on your own side? That's really what it was, right? Just dig into resources to try to understand it.
Yeah, and also there's not just one kind of stir, which kind of blew my mind So you've not only do you have string and you've got stir, but there's also there's static ones that are in the binary, and then there's other ones that are like they can be coerced from a string, and they don't have a static lifetime, and so just saying stir doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same thing. It could be pointing to some own data as opposed to data right in the binary. So there's a part in that book, but it doesn't tell you that right away, because that's too much. But later on, it says, by the way, there are actually two kinds of stirs as well, and this is what they are. So it kind of saves that for a little bit later when the reader's a little bit more prepared.
Out of all these chapters, like, what do you think is probably the most difficult for people to wrap their mind around?
Chapters 8 to 12. And it's not because it's So anybody who's near the end of the book won't find it difficult, but 8 to 12 is definitely where iterators and closures come in, and there's quite a bit of that. And so there's even a little note at the beginning of the book that it starts out really easy, then it gets fun by about 5 and 6 and 7. And then from 8 to 12, just you might really enjoy it, depending on who you are, but it also could be a slog. But after that, then it starts to level out, and then it gets pretty easy near the end. Like chapters 20 and 21 are just a tour of the standard library. So you just go over some of the types that we already learned and find some other interesting aspects to them. So by that point, it's pretty easy.
I would have thought that writing your own macros would be more difficult. That's chapter 22.
22, yeah.
Yeah.
It is, yeah, it's more difficult, but macros, I think everybody knows that you probably aren't going to be writing macros all the time. So it's not like closures. Like closures, you're always using them and you have to kind of have a feel for how they work. But macros are kind of like, okay, this is what they are. This is how you make them. They're pretty weird. Once you get used to them, you'll probably write your own macros is like the basic impression everybody gets. So I don't think anybody feels like they have to like master macros right away. So it's more of I think there's a lot less pressure when it comes to macros. Unless, of course, you got hired as a developer and everybody moved to Rust, and now you have to make a bunch of macros to make something happen. But otherwise, it's more of like an esoteric thing that you can kind of ignore for a while.
Yeah, luckily I haven't had to write any macros. Mm-hmm. I know some languages, like, they have rules about macros in terms of, like, rule number 1 is don't write macros.
Yeah.
Because they are quite tricky, and no matter what language you learn. But it seems like Rust is much more like, no, you should write macros. Because a lot of people do write their own macros. Yeah,
I guess, it kind of depends on what you need to. If you have a library of your own, you're probably going to be writing a lot of macros. If you have if you're working on a team and you're putting together a lot of macros, you're probably going to make your coworkers a little bit irritated. There's a good chance of that anyway. Like maybe you're having a little bit too much fun.
Because I think the problem with macros is that people, like you said, they can go a little bit gung-ho and go crazy about them and write these macros that don't really make a lot of sense, or maybe a little bit make things more complicated than what they are, right?
Yeah, like you could put together like the perfect macro that is called like implement all the things, exclamation mark, and then just like put like a few words in there, and then it'll like write your code for you. And then everybody has to figure out exactly what it is. And you can expand them, but even then it uses like the fully qualified syntax everywhere. And there's like a lot of underscores in macro, like the internal macro names, to make sure that they don't clash, which is why they look so weird a lot of the time. So it can be take a lot of getting used to.
One quick question. You do talk about you have chapter 17, Rust's most popular crates. Serde, obviously that's the best one, probably the most popular one.
Yeah.
But you did talk about chrono. I thought chrono is not being looked at for a while. Maybe I remember wrong.
Oh yeah, chrono's definitely used. Like where I work right now, we have a chrono interop. That's the basic. Still the basic time crate, I think chrono is.
Yeah, but I thought it's not being worked on anymore. Maybe it's a different library or something changed since I remember hearing about this.
Yeah, I know there was like there's a period for a little while where, what was it? There was like I don't remember exactly what happened, but I know what you're talking about. Like people had an issue with chrono, and it wasn't being worked on enough. But now there's actually a note in the book about like there's a recent change to chrono, so they are working on it. Like some of the function names have changed because internally some of them were able to panic, and so they changed. Like if the number of milliseconds or whatever was greater than a certain number, then it would just panic. And so they decided to change to deprecate those and then give them a longer name. So instead of like 2 UTC, it's called like 2 UTC opt, because it returns an option. And so I actually wrote in the book, you might be wondering why all these methods are ending with opt, because we've looked at a lot of methods that return options and none of them have opt. And it kind of leads to an interesting discussion in the book on how a crate might be worked on, and actively worked on, and you'll see changes like this. And the reason why is that there could have been internal panics that you weren't aware of in the former methods. And so it's also a good idea to look inside and then see if there's like any asserts or if so and so, panic, else, return whatever the value is. So it's good to look at the actual code just to make sure that there's not going to be any panics that you weren't aware of.
Well, what else I like that you also do is I'm just kind of flipping around as you're talking. You do also talk about unsafe Rust and testing. Like those are two things that I think are going to scare a lot of beginners off now.
Yeah, unsafe Rust. It definitely scared me. I didn't touch it at all. So I thought I might have to, but I've never had to use unsafe Rust really. But I think at that point in the book, it's a little bit fun. Like I remember seeing transmute for the first time and seeing people talk about transmute and how it's just the wackiest method. Like you just tell Rust to take some data and pretend that it's another type, and then it might just it could do anything. So I thought, okay, unsafe Rust should be mentioned because you might be working with like embedded or something where you or like working with FFI, like working with other languages that the compiler can't obviously knows nothing about. So it should be mentioned. And then there's like a few fun examples to show what transmute can do, and then later on why you might see unsafe in a few spots. Like sometimes people will want to use like an unchecked method, which is unsafe because they're absolutely sure. But also like a little mention that it doesn't necessarily make your code more performant. So you probably don't even want to use unsafe in that situation. And then testing, I thought was testing. I just thought was pretty neat from the beginning. It's just kind of test functions. They always take nothing, and the way you can tell if a test works is if it doesn't panic. And also the test driven development part. That's something that was really interesting to me in the beginning, where you can write test first and then try to write code to pass those tests, and that's an option for you. And so there's a small sample of how you might want to do that.
That's the most interesting for me because I don't think enough books that teach you languages talk about testing and how to test properly, let alone TDD, which not a lot of people. I'm actually kind of surprised. I mean, I've been programming for over 10 years. So TDD is something I really value and look at. But a lot of younger developers I talk with, they don't really do TDD. They maybe add the testing at the end, which I thought is weird. To me, it's just like, well, why can't I just use my test to help guide my code, to help drive my interface? Like, okay, this is my test. I want to use a method like this, and then I want to make sure it's working. And like that just makes sense to me. I don't understand how people cannot write that way. It just, I don't know, it just flows better for me at least.
Yeah, I think it's just itchy fingers. Like you want to start making something. It could also be like pressure at work. Like if you, if you're supposed to have something to show in the next week or two, and it looks like all you're doing is, making up tests and you haven't actually built anything, then it can feel like you're not getting anything done and you want to show something. And so you start building the code first and say, look at all the work I've done. So I think there's a lot of that.
Yeah. When you have that kind of pushing to get stuff done, like then usually get a lot more mistakes, but that's kind of a discussion for something else. But
yeah, I guess it depends on the work culture. But the place I worked at before the current my current workplace, the CTO was all about TDD, but it's still tough to do it first because we had to put things together for. So it was like a fintech company, and we had to make services to like interface with these big financial companies in Korea, and they wanted to see something like today. So they're like, we really wanted to do TDD, but they would, phone us and say, can you start testing tomorrow? And so we'd have to like quickly put something together to satisfy that. And so it's tough you need a few days to concentrate only on that. And it's sometimes tough to get even that.
Well, I mean, with financials, obviously, I think TDD or at least some form of testing makes the most sense whenever you're playing with money, right? You don't want to just somehow you're missing money. I was integrating with one vendor and like we would send trades and we never got acknowledgments, or we'd get acknowledgement and then we would say, what happened to this trade? And they would be like, well, we don't know. Like, what do you mean we don't know? We just sent you a bunch of money and you don't know what happened to it?
Yeah.
It's like insane. Some of these companies that do this stuff. So that's why I think, I can understand that prototyping and being quick to get something done is okay. But once you're dealing with like money and a lot of it, that's when you're going to answer for something. You're going to make sure you have what you got is correct, right?
Yeah. Well, one funny thing is one of the ones we dealt with, they used a system that was so old that they weren't even sure. So they were like, can you tell us what our system sent you? Like when, what was the error message? Because this was like, it was built in 1981 or so. And the company itself goes back to the 40s. And so, a lot of the people there, they just, inherited this system, and they have some documents and they kind of have a general idea of how it works. But we were kind of like helping them understand their own system at the same time. So at that point, there's basically no way to properly test because you don't know what the expected behavior is.
Oh yeah. Been there many times.
Yeah.
You should see these, and then they have nothing they could do to fix it.
Yeah.
That is a little bit freaky. And you're still, are they still working with these guys? I mean, it seems a little bit dangerous to be.
They probably are. I don't work there anymore since, what was it, March. Right now I work at a database company called EdgeDB. And this time the code is, their code is open source, so you can see everything. Whereas the former one, it was all closed source. So, I assume that they're still working with them, but not quite sure.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so you said there's only 24 chapters, right? Because I see all 24 here. When will this book actually be released? Because it's still in MEEP status, right? Which means it's still early access.
Yeah, it's pretty much done now. So what's left to do is some the images that's done, and Manning has thankfully they have a department. You give them your like, what is it, back of the napkin drawings, and then they turn them into something nice. Then there's the title, and if they change the title, then there are changes to make there. And after that, they'll be going through the comments from the most recent anonymous reviews, and then there's also the forum comments. So once I find out exactly what the title is going to be, then I'll make those changes in those 3 areas, and then I think that'll be it. And then after that is maybe translated into other languages. They do that quite a bit.
Now, will you be helping with that? Because you're a little bit of a polyglot when it comes to spoken languages, right?
Yeah. So the funny thing, actually, I didn't mention here is there's a Korean company that signed with me before Manning for the Korean translation. So they were actually the first to get in touch, and so I signed for that. So they have the rights to the Korean translation, and they've been doing it for, I don't know, a year and a half now, and they said they would be done by July, and now it's September. So I don't know, but if they finish that, then there will be a Korean translation of the pre-Manning post first EasyRust version. So like before Manning first got it, whereas the rest of the languages, Manning can find a publisher for that, and then translate that into a bunch of languages. And there's one language in particular that we have an interesting plan for, but I probably shouldn't say exactly what it is now. But it's not going to be your average translation.
It's very ambiguous. I don't even know what that means. So I guess we'll find out later.
I don't know. They're still trying to find a publisher to do that. So maybe I'll just, but it'll be different from all the other languages.
It's not going to be in pirate language or something weird like that.
No. And not a constructed language either. I like constructed languages, but it doesn't involve anything like that either.
So, I mean, overall, how has your experience been in writing this book? I mean, it seems like you had most of the work done, just took quite a bit of grind to kind of make it more in the Manning style, right? When you have a publisher, you have to kind of match your style. Yeah. And then also you're part of the series or at least as of now, you're part of the series for the Learning Something Over Lunch, where we call that the series of lunches.
Yeah.
I mean, it's probably been pretty smooth now.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of time. It's pretty much what I spent half of my evenings doing. So it depends on It depends on if you can put time into it every day. Basically, that's like the one decision to make. If you're thinking about doing a book or not, is can I sit down every night and do a little bit of work on this? Because sometimes it's not just creative work; it's also just rereading what you wrote. I've probably read this book an extra 10 times, just reviewing it and re-reviewing it, and then you're going to get a lot of feedback as well, and so it's definitely something you should do if you something you should do if you're good at dealing with. It's almost like a small extra job. So if you're working full time, then if you write a book as well, it's going to be your quarter full time job for the next year or so. So just think of it as that. And they also like to do a lot of promotions. So not just the book, they'll ask if you can do like some live coding or pretend live coding videos or interviews and things like that. And so if you're really into your book, then that's a lot of fun. But you have to, you'll end up promoting it a lot. Manning itself, the people there are great. They I like everybody at Manning, and they're a lot of the comments are really insightful. They get a few reviewers to work with you, and they go through the whole book, and it's just like a really fun back and forth process. So I really did enjoy that. It's quite a bit of work, but it's kind of like just feels like you're all just hanging out in the same space and just poring over your book and exchanging some ideas, and that makes it better and better.
I mean, what's next now that you're basically finishing up this book? Are you planning to take a rest? Are you looking at doing another revision? Are you looking at doing a different book, or are you just kind of done for a while and just?
I have an idea for another book, but what I want to do before that, and maybe instead of that, is so I want to make a game to it's like it'll be an RPG where it helps you learn a language. Like it starts out in English or some other language and then ends up 100% or almost 100% in your target language. So I want to give that a try. And so I haven't had the time to give that a shot. So I think I want to do that for a while.
Are you planning on making the Ultima 7 game that you were looking at a while ago?
Yeah, something like that. It's going to. So I think it'll be easier to make a roguelike game. Have you ever played any roguelike games?
I've heard of them, but I mean, maybe a long time ago, back when we had the green and black screens.
And you've got that and sign is the main character.
Okay.
Although you can put simple graphics in.
I think there's a book already, I think, about this in Rust. Have you seen that one?
Yeah, there's two of them. There's an older one, and there's also like this massive one by I think his last name is Wolverson or something. He's got a really cool last name. And
Herbert Wolverson.
Yeah, Herbert Wolverson, yeah. Every chapter has like a compiled WASM version of the game at that point, which is really neat. So as you read through, you can just like click on it and start playing at that point. So he made a really good book there.
Yeah, I think his book was top seller for longest time at his publisher thing. Yeah, we actually had him on the podcast a while ago.
Yeah,
I think it was for that book, but I can't remember now. But yeah, it's one of my many books I need to read. It's funny that I've actually read more of your book than I've read most of other people's books I haven't had time for. But yeah, again, I have to say your book is really great for like refresher. So if you're a listener for this podcast and you want to get back into Rust and say you haven't really been into it, this book is definitely great as a nice refresher to kind of get into stuff, because it's not like it is in a narrative format, obviously, because it's a book, but it's not like reading, like you're talking about Python, right? Like whenever I need to look up something in Python, it's always like I have to read a book to learn about one method, which just annoys the hell out of me. I just want to know what's the name of the method, what does it take, what does it return? That's all I care to know about.
Yeah, it's funny. Before I came here, I listened to one of your podcasts, one of the episodes, and you were trashing Python.
I do it all the time, offline and online. So okay. Yeah, I don't know. I think it was just a bad some of this comes from because I had just had a bad experience when I first used it. One of my first, basically my first programming job full time was doing ERP with Python called OpenERP, which is now called Odoo now, if you've ever heard of Odoo.
No.
And it's all done in Python, right? And just like the biggest pain in the ass was just that my editor had different white space settings than my boss's editor, and we had like a lot of issues trying to come together. So that was a huge pain. And then yeah, there was just lots of other weirdness. And then you've worked a little bit with Python before, right? I mean, do you ever see those in those init files? Like once you import a module, it could be running code that you have no idea what's going on.
Oh,
There's
like
a lot of really weirdness to it.
that monkey patching thing, you mean? Like where?
That was if you wanted to extend Odoo, you basically monkey patch. That's the only way to do it.
Yeah.
So but Ruby is one of my favorite languages, and it to the effect that you have similar thing, you have a similar issue of monkey patching. But I don't know, I felt like there was more surprises in Python because Python has always said that there's only one way to do it. But I found more than one way to do some things sometimes, and it is really annoying. But yeah.
You know, the place where I'm working at now, it's most of the code is in Python, but it's turning to Rust a little bit. Like the parser for the database got rewritten in Rust just like 3 weeks ago. So it's like creeping in bit by bit.
So you're probably using PyO3, right?
No idea. I haven't looked at the Python code, so okay. I know they use the what are they, data classes, I think, where you can try to get like as strongly typed Python as possible. Is that what they're called?
They have a typing module that, as far as I know, nobody uses. But again, I haven't.
I think they use that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen it used once in some sample code that we got given for a project. But otherwise, I've never seen anybody use it directly. So
yeah, I definitely I stay in the Rust world and also the query language. So that I wrote a book for them as well to teach the query language, but the Python compiler, I just don't look at that because that's a huge code base in a language that I can only poke around with and don't really have like a good instinct for. So I stay in the Rust world for sure.
Well, play around some more. You'll have your own opinion. For me, I used to be a full-time Python developer, even though I didn't like the language. So I hope people don't think that I'm just a hater and stay away from it and never give it a chance. I gave it a chance for more than a year, and I found ways to make it work for me. But I do have to say that the Python, the command line stuff is really good.
Mm-hmm.
It's built in with it. And the other thing that's really good about it too is the func tools. There's a thing called func tools where you can do currying and things like that. I think the func tools section is really good too. So other than that, not a huge fan. Obviously, you know that already.
Yeah. Have you ever seen a guy on maybe on LinkedIn or on O'Reilly called Noah Gift?
No, it doesn't sound familiar.
So he's a what's an ML ops, like machine learning ops guy, and he also worked with Python for quite a while, and then recently went all in on Rust, and he posts on LinkedIn on that quite a bit because he's put together this big, quite a few. What is it like? Just calling them samples makes it sound small. Like a bunch of ways to do all the things that that they're used to in Python, that you used to in Python in Rust. Like what's it called, Hugging Face, and a bunch of other things that I don't know that well. But if you're like a machine learning person, you'll recognize them and how to do your everything you want to do in Python and Rust and get like all the benefits from that. So he's pretty interesting to watch.
I'll take a look. Got it queued up. I have quite a lot of things queued up from our talk already. Take a look at it. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have any other questions. I mean, is there anything that you think that we should know about the book before we kind of wrap up?
Well, hopefully it contributes to, like, just in a broad sense. Hopefully the easy language that it uses will make it like easier to translate, easy for people who are using English as a second language to follow. Because you and I live in non-English countries, and there are a lot of people that can follow an English text, but when it's like full of like flowery language, then it kind of goes over their head, and their brain like stops parsing it, even if in general terms they're fluent in the language. And so it's kind of like an attempt to reach that part of the world as well. And so hopefully it'll help there, and then also hopefully you and I can make this Rust boom happen in Asia as well. Like I always have my videos in Korean, and then you live over here, and
We do have a code. I have to go look it up, but I'll put it into the show notes for if anybody's interested in purchasing the book. I highly recommend the book, even as a refresher. I think it's also good to hand out to people who are beginners who have some programming background, as we talked about. If they want to get into Rust, I think it's really great flow and everything. Even looking, like I said, looking at high levels doesn't really make sense, but when you're reading the book, everything flows perfectly, and then you really can understand the language quite quickly.
Yeah, that's the goal.
I would say the goal succeeded so far, but I haven't finished reading yet, so the verdict can't be out yet.
They'll like it. Everybody liked the last 2 chapters the most, so it's gonna finish well, I think, for you too.
I'm the kind of person that you tell me everybody likes something, and I'm just going to do the opposite.
Really?
So,
well, the last chapter, it involves building a laser pointer for your cat.
Oh, well, I got 2 chihuahuas, so it's not going to work out.
Or, well, sometimes dogs like them too.
I haven't tried it. That's a good question. I think they would.
So I think everybody likes those.
Actually, I think those are banned here, actually, because people were using them against the police to try to blind them.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a simulated laser pointer on your screen. It's a red dot.
Okay. Still, it might be banned. I don't know. It's kind of vague what the rules are for right now.
All right.
But in any case, again, thanks for coming on, and I'll put the code into the show notes. And,
thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you on.
And thanks for being in the same time zone, or basically the same time zone. That's nice.
Yeah, it is super convenient, right?